Have you ever thought about that strange gap in the Bible? It tells us about Jesus when he was 12 years old, sitting in the temple and amazing the elders with his knowledge. Then, all of a sudden, the story skips ahead. He shows up again at age 30, getting baptized in the Jordan River and starting his mission. But what about those 18 years in between? Where was this important spiritual figure during the best years of his youth? This gap isn't just a small detail. It might be the biggest untold story in spiritual history. It plays a big part in how billions of people understand faith and spirituality today. These missing years aren't just forgotten, they were carefully taken out of the official story. The real question isn't only where Jesus went during that time, but why these parts of his life were removed from the version that became Christianity. Think about it. What if the base of Western spiritual belief is only a small piece of Jesus' full journey? What if Jesus didn't only learn from Jewish traditions, but also spent those years gaining wisdom from the most respected spiritual teachings across Asia? That would change how we see his words, his purpose, and the lines we've drawn between Eastern and Western beliefs. There's some clear proof hiding in plain sight that shows something incredible. During those missing years, Jesus likely traveled far outside Judea, using ancient trade routes that had long connected the Mediterranean with places like India, Tibet, and Persia. In temples, schools, and spiritual centers around the ancient world, young Jesus didn't just learn, he became skilled in deep spiritual knowledge that would later shape everything he taught. Let's start by looking at what the official records tell us and what they leave out. The main Gospels talk about Jesus when he was born, and then again at age 12 when he spoke with teachers at the temple in Jerusalem. After that, there's nothing until he turns 30 and starts his public work. That's an 18-year gap, which is about 60% of his life before he began teaching. Quite a big missing part for a book meant to cover his life. What's even stranger is that this gap wasn't always empty. In the early years of Christianity, there were many writings that talked about what Jesus may have done during this time. Books like the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, the Arabic Infancy Gospel, and other old stories tried to fill in the blanks. But all of these were left out when the Church officially chose which books to include in the Bible. This happened at the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE under Emperor Constantine. Why? Because many of those writings showed Jesus traveling far from Judea, learning from Eastern teachers and Egyptian scholars. That version didn't match the story the Roman Church was trying to create. If Jesus had really studied with Buddhist monks in India, or learned deep teachings in Himalayan monasteries or ancient Egyptian schools, it would suggest his wisdom wasn't just his own. It was part of a larger, shared spiritual truth. And that would go against the idea that his message was one of a kind. But when we look at history, these kinds of travels aren't just possible, they're actually quite likely. The ancient world was much more connected than many people think. By the 1st century CE, trade routes linked the Roman Empire to India and China. The Silk Road had already been in use for hundreds of years. In Egypt, Alexandria was a major center of knowledge, with the world's largest library and scholars from everywhere. Jewish people had also settled in many of these places: Alexandria, Babylon, Persia, and even parts of India, keeping ties with Jerusalem. So, a young Jewish man who was interested in spiritual learning would have had clear paths to travel and connect with these communities. Think about the time when Jesus was growing up. During these missing years, the Roman Empire was going through a long stretch of peace and order called the Pax Romana. It was one of the safest times in history to travel long distances. So if someone wanted to explore faraway places, there couldn't have been a better time than this, right when Jesus disappears from the story. But just guessing isn't enough. What real proof do we have that Jesus might have traveled during those years? Some of the clues show up in unexpected places. Ancient Buddhist writings talk about a wise man from the West named Issa, who came to learn in India and Tibet during that same time. In 1887, a Russian traveler named Nicholas Notovich said he found old records at a monastery in Ladakh that told the story of Jesus, called Issa, visiting India and Tibet. Those records said he spent several years learning from Buddhist monks and Hindu teachers, practicing meditation and studying deep spiritual ideas before he went back home. Even though Notovich's story has been questioned, other people, like Swami Abhedananda and Nicholas Roerich, later said they also found proof of those records. But even more interesting are the deep similarities between Jesus' teachings and Eastern beliefs. Ideas like loving your enemies, choosing peace over violence, and many of his parables match closely with Buddhist teachings that were around hundreds of years before him. When Jesus talked about the kingdom within, it's very similar to Vedic teachings about knowing the true self. These aren't just small similarities, they're part of deep ideas that didn't exist in the Jewish faith of that time. One of the strongest clues comes from the words Jesus used. When he called himself the Son of Man, he used the Aramaic word bar nasha. That same phrase was used in Buddhist writings, translated into Aramaic during that time, to describe someone who had reached a higher spiritual level. These Buddhist writings were found in places like northern India and Bactria, where Jewish groups were already living. Jesus also often talked about the way when explaining his teachings, which matches the idea of the path in Buddhism and the way in Taoism. These similarities aren't just by chance. They include specific terms from Eastern spiritual teachings that somehow ended up in the words Jesus used. And the clues go beyond writings. They even show up in archaeology. In Kashmir, there's a tomb called Rosabal. People there have long believed to be the grave of Yuz Asaf, a holy man from the West who taught wisdom that sounds a lot like what Jesus taught. Some researchers think the name Yuz Asaf could come from a title meaning Jesus the Gatherer. What's also interesting is that the tomb faces east to west, like Jewish burial customs, not the north-south direction used in Islamic graves. But the strongest sign might be Jesus' teachings themselves. When he appeared at age 30 and started preaching, he spoke with such knowledge and depth that even the religious leaders were amazed. They often asked, "Where did this man get all this wisdom?" Because it was clear he knew more than what local teaching in Galilee could explain. He seemed to understand many spiritual ideas and even mix them together in a way that showed deep study and experience. Take the Sermon on the Mount as an example. Bible experts have said that this speech was very different from the usual Jewish teachings of that time. But when you compare it to Buddhist texts like the Dhammapada, the connection becomes clear. The Beatitudes, which focus on being humble, kind, and peaceful, look a lot like Buddhist steps toward enlightenment. Jesus also talked a lot about letting go of desire and being free from attachment, which are core ideas in Buddhism. Even how Jesus taught, using parables and thought-provoking questions, is similar to how Zen Buddhism teaches. His advice to be wise as serpents and innocent as doves sounds like Taoist lessons about finding balance between opposites. And his famous line, "The kingdom of heaven is within you," closely matches the Upanishadic idea that the divine is already inside each person, known as Atman. These kinds of ideas didn't exist in Jewish teachings of that time. So the real question isn't whether Jesus shared thoughts like those in Eastern teachings. We can see clearly that he did, but how he knew them if he never traveled or studied in those places. The signs become even stronger when we look at how he healed people. Jesus often healed by touching them, transferring energy, and telling them their faith had made them well. These methods match practices found in Eastern healing systems like Ayurveda and Tibetan medicine. His habit of going off alone to meditate also fits with Eastern spiritual practices more than Jewish ones from his time. Egypt also seems to have had an important part in Jesus' early life. In the Gospel of Matthew, it briefly says that Jesus' family went to Egypt when he was a baby to escape King Herod, but it doesn't tell us what happened while they were there or when they came back. Egypt had been a place of deep spiritual knowledge for thousands of years. It was known for its mystery schools, where people studied ancient wisdom about the mind, energy, and spiritual growth. The city of Alexandria, with its famous library and museum, had become a center where Greek ideas, Jewish beliefs, Egyptian traditions, and Eastern teachings all came together. There was also a group called the Therapeutae, a Jewish spiritual community near Alexandria, described by the writer Philo. They practiced healing and meditation in ways that were very similar to how Jesus would later work. Their name actually means healers, which is a word often used for Jesus too. The links between Jesus' teachings and Egyptian spiritual ideas can also be seen in the symbols he used. His focus on resurrection is similar to the core beliefs in Egyptian mystery teachings. His talk of being born again also sounds like the kind of language used in Egyptian spiritual training. These aren't just random similarities, they're specific spiritual and philosophical ideas that were part of the Egyptian tradition. Jesus' deep understanding of these topics makes it likely that he had direct experience with those teachings. But then, why would all of this be hidden? Why would the early church choose to leave these parts out of his story? The reason has to do with how Christianity was growing. As the new religion began to take shape, it wanted to present itself as unique and separate from other belief systems. By the 4th century CE, when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, the church leaders had a big problem to deal with. They needed to make their faith seem different and better than all the other spiritual beliefs that existed at the time. If Jesus had learned from Eastern teachers, been part of Egyptian mystery schools, and gathered wisdom from many places, then it would challenge the idea that Christianity held the only truth. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE and other meetings that followed didn't just define Christian beliefs, they also removed other versions of Jesus' life. Writings that talked about his travels to the East or his time in Egypt were labeled as false, destroyed, or simply not copied again. That way, those stories slowly disappeared. What we were left with was a carefully chosen version that fit what the church leaders wanted to show. This wasn't just rewriting history, it changed the whole direction of spiritual thought in the West. By cutting Jesus off from his ties to Eastern teachings and Egyptian wisdom, Western spirituality became separated from its Eastern roots. A divide was created that wasn't really there, and this false split is still around today. Teachings that could have been seen as different ways of understanding the same deep truth were instead turned into competing religions. So, what does this mean for us now? How does knowing about Jesus' possible journey through other spiritual traditions change how we see his message and our own path? For one, it encourages us to look at Jesus' words with a new perspective. When he says, "The kingdom of heaven is within you," we can hear the same idea as in the Upanishadic phrase, Tattvam Asi, meaning you are that, which says that divine power lives inside every person. When Jesus teaches peace and loving those who hurt us, we can see the connection to Buddhist teachings on kindness and compassion. Jesus' teaching about living in the world, but not being tied to it, is very close to Taoist ideas about acting without being attached to outcomes. Seeing this doesn't take away from who Jesus was, it actually adds more to our understanding. Instead of only thinking of him as the leader of one religion, we can see him as someone who brought together deep ideas from many spiritual paths and shared them in a way that made sense to the people around him. He becomes a connecting figure, someone who understood the shared truths across different beliefs. For your own spiritual path, this view helps break down the walls between different traditions. Practices like meditation, being kind, and staying present, which are common in Eastern teachings, aren't separate from Jesus' way. They are likely part of it. You don't have to pick between following Jesus and learning mindfulness, doing meditation, practicing yoga, or exploring other spiritual ideas from the East. These were probably also part of his own learning and growth. Here's something simple you can try. Jesus may have done the same during his time in the East. Sit quietly for 5 minutes each day and pay attention to your breathing. When thoughts come up, notice them without judging and gently bring your focus back to your breath. This basic mindfulness exercise, which comes from Buddhism, fits perfectly with Jesus' advice to stay alert and be aware inside. He also talked about going into a private place to pray, which points to the same inward focus that meditation encourages. Another helpful idea is to read the Gospels along with Eastern texts like the Dhammapada, the Tao Te Ching, or the Upanishads. You'll start to see similar lessons about letting go, being kind, and not getting caught up in material things. Looking at these together shows the kind of universal wisdom that Jesus likely discovered while traveling and learning from other traditions. When Jesus said, "Love your enemies and bless those who curse you," you can try putting this into action by practicing the Buddhist metta, or loving kindness meditation. In this practice, you send kind thoughts even to people who have hurt you. Doing this makes his message real in your life. It becomes something you feel, not just something you understand with your mind. This might be the same method Jesus used to develop the deep compassion he showed to others. If you're curious about healing, look into the idea of prana, which means life energy that flows through everything. Jesus often healed people by touching them and transferring energy. This shows he may have known and used these kinds of Eastern healing practices. Learning the basics of energy healing can help you connect to this side of Jesus' work, something many parts of modern Christianity no longer talk about. Even the way Jesus taught shows signs of Eastern influence. He often used paradoxes, statements that seem opposite or confusing, and taught people to think in deeper ways, not just in simple either-or thinking. Try sitting with two different ideas without rushing to fix the tension between them. Let the feeling of confusion open your mind instead. This kind of thinking is common in many Eastern spiritual teachings, where learning comes from sitting with deep questions, not always answering them right away. More importantly, if we see Jesus as someone who moved between different spiritual worlds, we too can become people who help connect spiritual ideas rather than divide them. In today's world, where religions are often separated, we can follow Jesus' lead by looking for shared wisdom in all paths instead of holding tightly to just one. Every tradition has something valuable to offer about our shared human journey. Jesus' missing years encourage us to look beyond the official version of his life and question the borders we've built between different sources of wisdom. What if all spiritual paths are really one path, just spoken in different ways? What if Jesus saw this and tried to explain Eastern teachings in a way his own people could understand? This idea changes our view of him, from someone claimed by only one religion to someone who stood for truth that crosses all borders and belongs to everyone. The missing years in Jesus' life aren't just an interesting mystery. They may hold the key to understanding spirituality in a more universal way. When we take a closer look at what Jesus taught, kindness, letting go of attachment, being aware through meditation, and seeing the divine within, we find these same ideas in many true spiritual traditions around the world. What if his travels through different spiritual cultures weren't just random, but actually a vital part of his mission to reveal this shared truth? So instead of asking whether Jesus went to India, Tibet, or Egypt, the better question is, how does this wider view help us grow spiritually today? If Jesus saw the value in learning from many traditions, maybe we can also grow by being open to more than just one path. If he found deep truths that existed beneath cultural differences, maybe we can too. As you think about this hidden part of Jesus' life, take a moment to look at your own path. Are you sticking to one belief system when there's a bigger, more connected wisdom out there? Are you keeping lines between traditions that might actually work together? Jesus' life shows us that real spiritual growth doesn't come from staying apart. It comes from bringing things together. It's not about building walls, it's about building bridges. One of the biggest lessons from Jesus' lost years is that the divine isn't limited to just one religion. It speaks through many. The light he talked about doesn't shine from only one place, but from many different sources. Each offers a view of the same greater truth. By rediscovering this forgotten part of Jesus' journey, we gain a fuller picture, not just of who he was, but of who we can become. If this story has stirred something inside you, don't let that feeling slip away. Subscribe now and be part of this journey for deeper wisdom that breaks through man-made boundaries. Every subscription isn't just a number. It's someone realizing there's more behind the surface of what we've been told. Come with us. As Jesus showed, real wisdom comes when we're ready to receive what the world has tried to hide.